Hello, citizen. In this first video, I would like to expose to you my personal experience, sharing with you, dear citizen, how I rose up from depression and the lack of self-esteem. To understand where I am now, we must first dwell in my past. My mother was a first-wave feminist and aspired to be an independent woman. She comes from a huge Quebec Catholic boomer family. Indeed, my pious maternal grandmother had 10 children, trying to make ends meet with the blue-collar salary my grandfather earned. My mother had a poor childhood, sharing beds with her sisters. Most of her siblings quit elementary school to work for the well-being of the pious family. Her and my aunt, in the youngest, were the exceptions, attending higher education against the will of her parents. No man was ever going to rule her life. Her freedom from man's tyranny was at the top of all of her decisions. To her, loving and caring about others was her primary value. As a side effect of this value, she expended lots of her energy trying to please others, thinking this value was inherent, even if hidden, to all humans. Draining her physically and mentally, this kindness, along with the burden of raising 2 boys by herself, drove her to depression and burnouts. She really did think that a lonely mother, with the help of government establishments, daycare services, and my father's alimonies, was enough for her to raise my brother and me. My father is a liberal who believes in individualistic freedoms over nuclear family hierarchies. He comes from an Anglo-Saxon bourgeois family of 4 children. All had everything a middle-class family could ever dream of. Nice houses, chalets, cars, great meals, degrees and social credibility. My paternal grandfather, a conservative electrical engineer, traveled the world earning high salaries, but never was really present to take his father's role, putting career over family. His wife, my grandmother, was a singer and artist who never really caught an audience. She got my grandfather's attention because of her rich family with very high social capital. Because of her failures, she became bitter, always complaining about her situation, taking liberal values as an act of opposition to her absent husband, even going as far as joining the Liberal Party of Canada as a very active member. She then raised our kids with these values, my father being amongst them. His education was paid for by his parents to follow in his father's footsteps as an engineer. Although he was blessed with great intelligence, the effort to get the degree was too much for him and never got the diploma they paid for. Against the will of his father, he enjoyed studying marketing and started his career as a publicist. My parents came together in a blind date and decided to get married a few years after. To their saying, they never really loved each other. My mother really wanted children, and in that shaky union, my brother and me were born 2.5 years apart from each other, me being the eldest. At 8 years later, my mother was more and more thinking about divorce, since my father was absent, doing not unlike his father before him, putting career over family. But he had money issue linked to drinking and gambling, slowly draining the family's earning against my mother's will. On a Thursday, a child saw his parents argue and his father leave. And since then, my family has been shattered. My mother never remarried, and so we never had a stepfather. Only 2 years after the divorce, my father remarried with one of his colleagues, a high-achieving woman who shared his liberal values, her too being a divorcee. He was his superior in the company's hierarchy at the time, and thus, to prevent conflict, he went on and changed company, giving her an opportunity to take his place, which she did, and even more. She was nice to my brother and me at first, trying to help us and caring about our difficulties. They got married after my stepmother got pregnant with her first kid at around 35 years old. Then they had a second when she was around 38 years old, both girls. That was when my father started to really put my brother and me more and more as a background project, the remains of his past life, to focus on his new opportunity to raise his two girls in a stable household. Indeed, to my stepmother, we were a reminder of the past failure of her husband, as by then we were becoming lost and angry teenagers. As my mother was moving every 5 years to new cities, I was I was drifting through life without any meaning or identity, struggling to make new friends, being tagged most of the time as the new kid, the stranger. Bullied, rejected, and betrayed by many, I became violent, angry, and bitter, turning to drugs for comfort. I had my first clinical depression at 16 years old. My lonely mother, unable to deal with a violent teen, thought it would be best to send me in the stable household my stepmother and father built. Unfortunately, she was only sending me to another bully's mercy. My father, still being plagued by gambling problems, had to submit many of his liberties to his wife, who took it upon herself to lead the family to proper horizon. Her passive-aggressive tyranny was overwhelming, as she took control of my weak father's role, dictating to him how to raise the lost teen creeping in their basement. I wasn't giving any encouragements, only blames. After a year or so, they had enough, and since I was soon to be legally an adult, they decided it was time for me to start being independent. And so, I continued drifting without guidance from job to job, always struggling to make ends meet, hanging out with criminals and thugs, and taking drugs to forget about all of it. Then I fell in love with a stable girl. I was her first, and she helped me get a bit of self-esteem back. But she never really wanted to commit to our relation, thinking she had so much more to experience. I made new friends, good people for most part. I was still a stranger to them, but at least they weren't trying to abuse of my good faith. All was well for around 5 short years, but as I was always looking for attention and new pleasures to experiment, I became disloyal to my girlfriend when she left for a 9 months trip. That mistake cost me her love and all the progress I made to my self-esteem. I had other women in my life, but until now, never really cared about founding a family. After 2 suicide attempts, I was at the lowest point in my life, in my early 30s. The only solution professionals were offering were psychoactive drugs to numb my pain. Unwilling to become a mindless zombie, I took it upon myself to ameliorate my situation. Everything at that point was hard. Waking up in the morning, making food, even having fun. But then I decided to make my life better, even if it was extremely hard. I was at the bottom of my barrel anyways. Up was the only way I could go. At 33 years old, I became a student, earning my first diploma and then my second. I still had liberal values back then, thinking I was a feminist and hanging out with all sorts of degenerates, pointing out to people who were racist, sexist, and so on, thinking love will save the world. I even identify myself as polyamorous to a point. But then, it all came crashing down, and depression struck again as the disillusion of my lifestyle dissipated. It was a worldview filled with great intentions, but rarely people who acted upon them, always with abstract solution to very real problems. That is when, on one night, at yet another party of degenerates, that I met my first real nationalist friend. Everyone hated him there, and fled his presence, and that caught my curiosity. Why was everyone so afraid to debate him? Who was this guy anyways? That is when the process started. He probably saw me as who I really was, a lost soul looking for true meaning in his life. He kept giving me videos to watch and documents to read, At the time, I had intimacy with a radical feminist, self-proclaimed non-binary who saw me as an ally. I became more and more aware of the lack of consistency in her discourse as I tried many times over to understand her vision of reality through logic. She became scared of my questions, seeing them as aggressions. That was the breaking point of my liberal values I held dear all those years, and I started opening myself to the red pill my nationalist friend was offering. From there, I became motivated by the search for my lost identity, and through that process, I came to realize what was truly important. Our people, our values are the driving force behind strong, assertive men with the will to create a strong nation. I purged my social media account of all degenerates. I started to act upon my newfound values, helping our people around me. I found a strong woman who was willing to compromise our personal freedoms in order to create a good household and family. And there it is, citizen. How I cured myself from my pathological disorders through self-sacrifice, helping our people closest to us, associating with people who have the will to act upon their constructive values, and finding my identity. I, I tried to summarize my story as well as I could. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to know more, do not hesitate to leave a comment. Help me make our nation thrive. God wills it.